Chapter 18, French Revolution. Before I get started, I probably need to warn you, young people. I record this from my home. And in all honesty, the guy across the street has been working in his yard and power washing his house, making all kinds of racket. He's quiet right now. I think he's on a break for lunch or something. But if you start hearing some weird noises, I either may stop or just, if they're not too terribly bad, I'll just keep on going. Now, I do want to remind you that although there is a lecture and a PowerPoint, we're only covering the high spots, so to speak. To get the details and the nitty-gritty, you're going to have to read your chapter or at least skim it. We don't have the time to spend as much time as I would like to on the French Revolution. I would love to spend a couple of sessions on it, but since we have to do 2 chapters a week, we don't have time but to do much of anything but the highlights. So bear with me. The French Revolution in its highlight form. Oh no, there goes my phone. Let's just ignore it. France is considered to be the center of European culture. Everybody spoke French at their courts. Everybody admired their French courts. They thought that was just the greatest thing that ever happened. It was considered, as I said, to be the center of European culture. At the time of the European Revolution, it was against the concept of the ancient regime. In other words, they just about had it the way things have been always. But the monarchs are trying to maintain control, but the peasants are getting a little bit out of hand and rowdy and demanding things that they don't think they should have. But the aristocratic nobles are also resenting the monarchical inroads on their ancient freedoms. They don't like what the king's trying to do, like they had to spend so much time at Marseille. They had to do other things that they didn't have to do in the past. The middle class resented a society of privilege for the nobility that was what they figured was outmoded and was ignoring the realities of this new commercial economics that we've got going. Now, it's a growing middle class. It's not too large right now, but it's growing. And the peasants, that's who you and I would probably be, the bulk of the European citizens, they resent the increasing demands of the central government from the nobility and the monarchy, because we have to pay taxes to the local duke, we have to pay taxes to the local king, we have to pay taxes to the local magistrate. Every time you turn around, we're having to pay something. So the age of revolution is going to spread throughout the lands of all of Europe. This is just a brief little map showing you that it wasn't just in the United States. It's going to be happening in South America, Central America, as well as Europe. But the French Revolution took place in about 4 stages, and we'll spend just a little bit of time on each one of the stages. Of course, the moderate stage, when it started in 1789, it was mostly peaceful. It was primarily the monarchy versus the nobility, and both of them are hoping to use the States General, the general public, you and I, as leverage. And of course, it ends with a new constitution and a supposedly legislative monarchy, like in England, where they had a constitutional monarchy. But that didn't work, and then we had this, what they called the radical stage, or the Terror, started in 1792. And all the peaceful outcomes that had been accomplished by the poor, inexperienced leadership and the legislative and inability of Louis XVI, it just didn't seem to work at all. France declared war on Austria and Prussia. Really great, good thing to do, you know. Fears that gain of revolutions were being attacked from within leads to a radical overthrow of the new government that had just been formed in the moderate stage. Well, that lasted till 1794, which wasn't too terribly long. And then civil war erupts, and we got the end of the radical stage, and you have a group of people called the Directory that's going to try to run France. But we've got civil war, as I said, and you've got external war continuing to impact the revolution internally, and you've got more and more overthrows of local various governments. See, one of the things they did is try to help the unemployment situation in France, was they formed an army, figuring that the army could march off, and if they won, they would come home with booty, and if they didn't win, they'd be killed. So it takes care of the unemployment problem. The Directory cuts a hold of Napoleon and tries to get him to help put down the citizens. And Napoleon, working with Abbé Sieyès, was able to consolidate control. And before you know it, Napoleon ousted him, and the citizens of France elected Napoleon as the Emperor of France in 1804, just a few short years after he arrived in Paris. It seems kind of ironical that you had a rather disastrous, bloody rebellion and got rid of your king, and then all of a sudden now you've got an emperor. But let's go back to the beginning, the coming of the revolution. Now, the citizens or society in France was divided into 3 estates. The first estate consisted of all your clergy. The second estate was your nobility, which also included your king. The third estate was everybody else, whether you were a wealthy middle-class merchant or whether you were the poorest villager or city dweller or you and I. But we, as a third estate, had no voice. And really, the difference between the nobles and the non-nobles is getting very gray, because some of these people are so rich and they get more money than the nobles have, and they can buy a title. But if you were really an honest-to-gosh born noble, your wealth was tied to the land. You didn't have cash, so to speak, like this newly Burgonoy did. The influx of the new wealth came from banking and shipping and slave trade and money, and even though they were wealthy, they're still considered the third estate unless they buy a title. And some of the, what do we call them? The, I'm drawing a blank on the name. Locke, Voltaire, and Montesquieu were appealing to the discontented nobles and wealthy middle class. They weren't intended to talk to us at all because we had no power. We were just nothing to them. The noble leaders became defenders of national political community and were threatened by the king and his ministers trying to make new laws. This new rich middle class, the Burgonoy, identified more with the nobility, as I said, than with us common folks. And prosperous members of this third estate are beginning to air their frustrations loud and long in public debates. But there's rising tensions even among them, especially those who are just starting to earn money, and I guess you'd say they're on the lower ladder of the success. They want some economic reform. They want to simplify the tax system. They want to free the national economy from the mercantilistic restrictions that we had with our colonies. The government should lift controls on the price of grain, because in all honesty, the French economy is not doing well. It's failing. The general prices have risen, and this causes more and more of a hardship for us peasants, and especially the poor urban workers, because we've had poor harvests and poor weather. The price of grain is going up. And with more and more people having less and less, there's less demand for manufactured goods, which means that if I used to have a worker that worked for me to make something and nobody's buying what I'm making, I'm going to lay him off. So we have more unemployment. It's a vicious downward spiral. But the peasants, us, like I said, we owed obligations to our landlord. We owed them to the state. We owed them to the church. We owed them to the local magistrate. Every time you turned around, someone had their hand out wanting their money. They had direct and indirect taxation, and it was a very heavy burden. And then we had something called the corvée. Corvée is just it's a Roman derivative word, actually, that means free labor, where basically you're going to do something to eliminate a tax that you owe, or just because you are obligated to your landlord. It's a way to get around having to pay taxes. And usually the women were covered with this. The urban poor, of course, we're going to be ignored. We've got no clout. And we face a high tax burden. We face a high price of goods in the cities. They've got an ineffective tax system. And taxes tied to social status, and they vary from region to region. You could have a high tax in Paris and a low tax in Bourgogne. But paying off Louis XVI's debts, especially the ones that he had incurred by helping the Americans in their revolution, was going to be hard to take. But Louis XVI was anxious to serve as an enlightened monarch, and he did try to make some changes. But unfortunately, he could never get it through the Parliament. He could never get his aides to go along with it. He wanted to reduce taxes. He wanted to eliminate torture and eliminate some of the execution reasons, but they wouldn't let him do it. Two gentlemen by the name of Turgot and Necker were used as finance ministers, and they tried a little bit, but didn't get very far. And of course, Marie Antoinette, the king's wife, she liked to give things to her friends, monies, positions. So tensions between the central government and the provisional parliament, it's going to slow reform, because you got somebody who lives in, say, out here in Niceville. They really don't care that much what's going on downtown Charleston, so you're going to have a hard time getting us to get on board for anything. Cologne and Bourbon proposed new taxes. They wanted a stamp duty and a direct tax on agricultural products. Well, this wasn't going to go over very good, so Louis the King summons the Assembly of Notables. And the aristocrats that showed up used the financial emergency to get some reforms out of the king. But they insisted that any new tax must be approved by the Estates General, which was all 3 estates. So the Estates General was summoned by Louis in the summer of 1788, and the first time in, 74 years, as he's called them. The 3 estates decided they wanted to be seen as not a one group, one vote, because the entire 3rd estate, they wanted each member to have a vote. So they elected delegates, and they drew up what they call a list of grievances that they had. And they resented the way that it was received by the other estates. It just, was like, what do you think you're doing? Historically, the estates met and voted by estate, each estate having 1 vote. Abbe Sieyès says, what is the 3rd estate anyway? But the 3rd estate agreed that the estate's delegates should sit together and vote as individuals, which would double the number of people that were in the 3rd estate, which would give them more people and more votes than the other 2. So Louis opposed, and then he changed his mind in December. In June of the next year, the delegates of the 3rd estate declared themselves the National Assembly. Well, this wasn't going to happen. They weren't going to be allowed to meet, so you have to have a place to meet, and Louis knocked them out, so they found a place called the tennis court. And I think I have a picture of it here. Yeah, there it is. This is the picture of the tennis court. They're calling themselves the National Assembly, and they swore an oath not to disband until France had a new constitution. I think in the center of the painting, standing with his hand up, is Jean Ballet, president of this new assembly. And the Abbe Sieyès is seated at the table. I don't see a table, do you? Well, it says there's a table there. And a member of the 3rd estate embraces in a symbol of national unity. Looks to me like they're shaking hands and not embracing. Oh, over here's the far left. Yeah, okay. Here we have somebody embracing. Or as he's knocking the snot out of him. I can't tell which. The signal deputy who refused to take an oath sits at the far right. Oh, I guess this would be this guy over here with his hands crossed. He's not going to take an oath. Arms clasped against his chest tightly. So the first stages of the French Revolution are, like I said, they're fairly peaceful as revolutions go. But the public attention is to the events going on in Paris, and they're all paying a lot of attention. Meanwhile, the price of bread is soaring. Now, it may seem funny to us, how come you're so upset over the price of bread? Because a lot of people, that's all they had to eat was bread. Bread, bread, bread. Bread is a staff of life. Rumors begin to circulate that Louis was about to stage a coup d'etat. Oh, well, that's not good. So the Parisian workers, who are called sans-culottes. Now, culottes are just, I don't know if you've ever seen a picture of these old people, and not old people, but the old golfers. They had pants that came down just below their knees, and they wore socks up to the edge of their pants. They're called, we had what they call culottes when I was a kid. I just called them pedal pushers. So sans-culottes means without those type of breeches. So the workers of Paris are starting to wear long pants now, which is an indication of station in life and manhood. They organized a militia of volunteers, and the common folks are controlling the new provisional city governments and the Parisian National Guard. Well, they hear rumors of the fact that the king has stored weapons and grain in the local jail, the Bastille. So they raided the Bastille. Well, unfortunately, there was only, I think, 1 prisoner in there. There was no storehouse of weapons or food at all. But it was a symbolic gesture. Their July the 4th is July the 14th, the fall of the Bastille. But a great fear spread to the peasants in the countryside because they didn't know for sure what's going to happen, and they're hearing rumors that the king's army's on their way. So the peasants begin to attack and burn the manor houses and destroy the manor records, because you can't collect taxes on something if you don't have a record of what I owe. In the October days, Parisian women marched to Versailles and demanded to be heard. Well, the National Guard led Louis back to Paris, and more than 200 in the National Assembly members fled from their homes all across France. In August, the National Assembly abolished all forms of privilege. They abolished the church tie, which was mandatory, the covey, which may force you to work for nothing, hunting privileges for the nobility, tax exemptions for the nobility, and any monopoly. So they, in effect, obliterated any remains of feudalism. The National Assembly declared full civil rights to Protestants and Jews, and they abolished serfdom and banned slavery in France. Here's the Women's March on Versailles. In August of '89, the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen, and it was a beautiful letter, beautiful. It was based on the writings of Lafayette, and Lafayette, well, he was been introduced to a lot of this stuff when he helped General Washington in the American Revolution. And basically, this rights of man and citizen defined the natural rights as a private property, liberty, security, and resistance to oppression. Citizens were divided into two groups: active citizens and passive citizens. The passive citizens are going to have rights guaranteed to them under the law, but it's going to be the active citizens who pay the tax and they can vote and hold office. Well, we started having people write about it. You got something called The Rights of Women, written by Mary Wollstonecraft. She wrote A Vindication of the Rights of Man, in which she declared that women should have the same rights as men do. Olympia de Georges wrote the Declaration of the Rights of Women and Citizens. So you've got, all of a sudden, you've got not just men and peasants and nobility and stuff. You've got the women are getting involved. And women have never really been involved in anything. They're starting to join clubs, and they're demonstrating, and they're debating. And women are being seen as citizens of the country. But eventually they're going to be seen as a threat to public order, because women just have no sense of control, you know. Well, the National Assembly, well, they didn't like the church. It was basically the most divisive issue in the Revolution, because the church played a rather large role in the countryside, and even in our country, the church played a large role in the countryside. The Civil Constitution of the Clergy in July of 1790, and the bishops and the clergy are now subject to the laws of the state, and the salaries are to be paid from the public treasury, not from the local church. A lot of people resented the privileged positions of the church and the priest, but the parish church as an institution in the local economy and local cities and towns was very great. But then the National Assembly confiscates the church land and sells it off. And since you've eliminated the mandatory tithes and things, all of a sudden the church has no way to have any money to do anything. They finally get them in a constitution in 1791. And as administration reform, it's going to eliminate ancient provinces, 83 departments with a capital city only 1 day's ride from all citizens. Active versus passive citizens is going to be tied to land ownership now. But the king's going to retain simple veto power. You're going to have judicial reform. You're going to eliminate all those ancient courts. You're going to eliminate the parliament. The judges are going to be elected, not appointed by the king. All harsh punishments are going to be removed. Hey, this sounds like pretty good, right? In the economic area, the guilds are going to be eliminated because they had too much power. We're going to introduce the metric system. We're going to eliminate strikes, and unions and monopolies are going to be outlawed. There's going to be military reform. The army of 150,000 volunteers is going to be set up. You're going to eliminate the nobles in leadership, and you're going to open the doors for the talent in the military to rise to the top. Like cream rises to the top. Well, that all sounds pretty good, doesn't it? It sounds like they were on their way. In the publication of publicitation? How is that? What is that word? The politicalization. Oh, got my glasses on. Politicalization of the common people, especially in the cities. And there's a bunch of them in the cities. They read newspapers. If they don't read newspapers, they have it read to them, and they've got political clubs. And everybody seems to have more political awareness now, especially when you look at the store, the fluctuations of the price of bread. And, of course, there's demands for cheaper bread, demands for government to do something about inflation. Well, these are not unreasonable demands. But Louis XVI is weak and vacillating. He was forced to accept the Civil Constitution of the Clergy. In June the 20th, 1791, he tries to leave the country. It's called a flight to Grenez. Well, he's captured, and they made a big joke of it because he was dressed as a woman when he was captured. So the revolution in France had the support from a large range of thinkers and philosophers, but it's going to get radical here very shortly. And everybody in Europe takes it one side or the other. Political societies begin to form outside of France and proclaim their allegiance to the revolution. Even in the United States, Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson, not Benjamin Franklin, but Thomas Jefferson was very much for the revolution. He used to wear the fleur-de-lis and the hat and didn't believe any of the horrible stories that started coming out. The emigres stirred up counter-revolutionary sentiment by going to the Americas and going to England. Edmund Burke wrote the Reflections of the Revolution in France, and it was not a very good look. He said they were destroying political society and destroying social fabric. Radicals hoped that the war would expose traitors. In August, Austria and Prussia came close to capturing Paris. In August the 10th, 1792, Parisians attacked the king's palace. So the counter-revolution shifts to a more egalitarian leaders of the Third Estate, the Jacobins. Members are throughout of France. They proclaimed themselves the voice of the people and the nation, and they demanded a call for a new national convention to write another new constitution. Then the September massacres began. Paris mobs, they decided to try traitors, and they captured them. I think there was thousands that were killed. And so the National Convention declares France a republic. And Louis was placed on trial for being a traitor. He was executed 30 days after he was arrested. And of course, that shocked all of Europe. Even some of the people who were committed revolutionaries in France were a little bit put out and debated the necessity of committing such a dramatic act. The sad thing was that the entire National Convention of over 700 members acted as a jury, and although it was nearly unanimous in finding the king guilty of treason, a majority of only one approved the final death sentence. And those who voted for Louis XVI's execution were known forever as regicides, who killed a king. The National Convention and Constitution of 1793, they abolished slavery in the French colonies. They confiscated property of the enemies of the revolution. They set maximum prices for grain, and they set a new revolutionary calendar. Now, this new revolutionary calendar, there was 10 days a week instead of 7. There was 3 weeks in a month instead of 4. There was only 10 hours in one day instead of 24. And the calendar also used new names and new counting of the years. Year 1, year 2, year 3. I mean, they eliminated all forms of Christian religion. The small armies of sans-culottes attacked the hoarders and profiteers, and there was even military reforms. France faced Britain, Holland, Spain, and Austria in a war. The revolutionary government drafted all men capable of bearing arms, levied a masse. In other words, you're going to do it for nothing. All males were conscripted, and of course they weren't going to be paid. You're going to either win the battle and take home booty, or you're going to go home dead. And the French military successes, we couldn't believe it. These people were not trained military, but they're fighting for life, death. And they had a lot of zeal, and the size of it, they were just overwhelming the armies of the neighboring countries. They did a darn good job. So this is a picture of sister republics in France, and she is either ruling them directly or with military control. But the Reign of Terror, the convention delayed adoption of the Constitution with male suffrage in its desire to maintain control, and something called the Committee of Public Safety is not going to be in charge. And they were determined to, quote, make terror the order of the day, unquote. These new radical leaders were Jean-Paul Marat. He opposed anybody who was a moderate, and he edited in the newspaper The Friend of the People. Jacques Danton, very popular political writer in The Friend of the People. But he was getting tired of all this. He was getting tired of the terror. He was getting tired of the revolution. And so he was considered an enemy of the revolution. He was sent to Madame Guillotine. Maximilien Robespierre, he became the leader in reality of the Committee of Public Safety. He's trained as a lawyer, and in the beginning he wasn't too bad, but he became president of the National Convention, and he just seemed to go overboard and wanted to get rid of any enemies of the state. Dictatorship and repression, you betcha. But the committee's facing opposition not only from the right, but also from the left. And they needed to have absolute control, and they called themselves the Mountain. They set up at the very back of the convention center. And they wanted to purge any moderates from the National Convention. And meanwhile, rebellions breaking out, civil wars breaking out in the cities, locally, Lyon, Bordeaux, Marseille. So the committee begins rounding up suspects. In September of 1793 through 1794, 40,000 people were killed. Executions ran as high as 16,500, and more than 300,000 were incarcerated between March of 73 and August of 74. It just getting worse and worse. The sans-culottes or workers' trousers replaced breeches, and they wore the red cap of liberty with a fleur-de-lis on it. And they called each other citizen and citizeness. So we have a second revolution, reversed the trend toward decentralization, and we're going to replace all the local officials now with deputies on a mission. And of course, one of the first things we do is close down all the women's political clubs. And of course, with the erosion of the traditional institutions, they've already outlawed the church, the guild, and the parishes. So, who's going to be running the asylum? It was replaced with patriotic organizations. But the counter-revolutionary groups were also popular movements. It seems like these poor people, they just can't make up their minds. The 9th of Thermidor, and Thermidor is the French word for July. Robespierre has gone too far. So they kick him out of the convention, and he actually gets sent to the guillotine himself, along with 21 other people who he supposedly was conspiring with. So now we have something called the rise of the White Terror. The law of the maximum prices is repealed. The National Convention adopted another new constitution, and we're going to call this the Constitution of Year 3. All with that new calendar, remember, 10-hour days. I don't know how you're going to do it. Does the night become a day then? Well, anyway. Suffrage for all adult males who could read and write. And they're going to have indirect elections. You're going to not vote for the person. You're going to vote for electors, and the electors are going to vote for the party that's going for office. So the legislative body is going to invest executive authority in a board of 5 men called the Directory. And this new constitution, it did include a Bill of Rights. You have freedom of press, freedom of religion, freedom from established politics, political freedom. They've passed some good laws, but they don't enforce them. From the Directory to Bonaparte. Well, the Directory, this is basically the third form of government we've had. You've got radical left and conservative right. They're not for it. They could not control things are going, and there's open civil war between royalists who want the king back on the throne and the revolutionaries who want to keep on killing. So they've called on Napoleon to come help them control this new government. And Napoleon, well, he had a lot of victories. He was Corsican. He wasn't Italian. He was a Corsican. He had victories in the Italian campaign, and he tried to defeat Britain by attacking the British forces in Egypt and the Near East. And he's the one that brought back the lot of, I guess you'd say, got us started in archaeology in Egypt. The French fleet was defeated by Nelson, British Lord Nelson, at the Aberdare. And when he gets back to Paris, basically the Directory thought that he was going to support them, but he kind of pulls up in front of him with his army and turns his guns on them. Abbé Sieyès is back in his leadership, and he uses Napoleon to help him overthrow the Directory. The coup was in November of 1799, Constitution of year 5, 6, 7, 8 now. November of 1799, Napoleon is declared a temporary council. 1 month later, he was named First Consul, which in effect removed any influence that Sieyès had. He assumed the title of the First Consul and governed in the name of the Republic. He creates the Concordat, and he ends hostility between France and the Church. Oh, wow. Oh, my goodness, we got another new constitution. Yeah. What's this, the fourth one? Universal male suffrage. 2 legislative bodies and a plebiscite. We're going to put questions to the public to vote. The public, general public. third estate. There's reorganization of the state. There's going to be an abolition of privileges based on your birth, and you're going to open up careers to people of talent. So you could be born the son of a bread maker, and you're smart and know what to do, and you could rise to the top. He installed a generally fair system of taxation. He replaced the local elected officials with centrally appointed prefects and sub-prefects. And he issued something called the Napoleonic Code, which is still a beautiful piece of literature to read. He abolished all feudal privileges, all property rights. He enforced paternal authority and the subordination of women and children to the man of the house. He enforced equality before the law as long as you were male. He outlawed arbitrary arrest and imprisonment. He rationalized the educational system. Oh, man. He established the lycées, which is a high school, to train civil servants to work in the government. He brought military and technical schools under state control, or his control. He funded a national university to supervise the entire system. And, of course, the people who benefited the most were still the third estate, but they're the upper growing, the Bourgeois, the bankers, the businessmen, the merchants. But the Treaty of Amiens in 1802 with England brought the first European peace in over a decade, and now Napoleon can turn his attention inward and take care of some things in Paris and France. He began to make allies without regard to their political past or affiliation. He readmitted these immigrants, the people who had left France to escape the persecution. He allowed them to come back. He married the very beautiful and ambitious Josephine de Beauharnais, and after a failed assassination attempt, with a national plebiscite, the Parisian and French voters voted to make Napoleon Emperor of France. He crowns himself Napoleon I at Notre Dame in December of 1804, and he even had the Pope invited to the cemetery. It's not cemetery, it's a celebration. Oh, see what happens when you get going too fast. Okay. Charlemagne had done that before, back in 800 A.D. He had invited the Pope to his coronation, then he took the crown and put it on his head himself. But by having the Pope there, it just seemed to make his claim much more strong. There was a coalition of other people in Europe, the Austrians, the Prussians, and the British. And finally, Russia and Austria withdrew, but actually he'd made peace with Britain. Then the battlefield again. Napoleon's leading his men on the battlefield, and he uses shock attacks. He calls his men the Grande Armée. The Battle of Austerlitz in December, he won. There's a series of small little countries from Austria's former empire and the old German kingdoms, and he's either ruling them directly or he's got his family members on the throne. He's always got his fingers in the pie and control. But anytime he took over a country, he gave them the same freedoms that you had in France. If you became a Confederate, a buffer, and actually what he's doing is he's forming a ring around France that's going to be loyal to him, that other people have to go through to get to him. His empire at its height. He introduced his reforms throughout the area. He eliminated feudal and church courts and created a single legal system and gave civil rights to both Protestants and Jews. And of course, people nowadays, they debate whether Napoleon was a real liberator or whether he's just an upstart emperor. I think there was a little bit of both. He did a lot of good, but he did a lot of damage too. Administration, modernization, and careers open to talent. This was something brand new. He reorganized the public works and educational system. He collected taxes to support the new state, and he insisted on liberty and the rule of law. New electoral districts. And all the government emanated from Paris and Napoleon. The legacy, he accumulated useful knowledge, and an image of posterity became the Arc de Triomphe, which is still standing. Since an invasion of Great Britain was going to be difficult, Napoleon shifted to an economic war. He did a blockade of British goods. That was a mistake because Britain started trading with South America and Europe becomes divided into two economic camps. Now, I love this statement. Napoleon's ambition aids his undoing. Yeah, I think My father used to have an expression, your eyes were bigger than your tummy when you put too much food on your plate. I think Napoleon's eyes were bigger than his army was able to deliver. He wanted to remake Europe as a new Roman Empire ruled from Paris by him. He did want Republican Roman ideas in the art and architecture and clothing, and if you've seen the way Josephine dressed, she dressed in the old Roman style. Made his brothers and sisters monarchs of every newly created kingdom. And then he divorced Josephine and married Marie Louise, daughter of Francis I of Habsburg. Wanted to move up in society, you know. So France is fighting Russia, Prussia, Austria, Sweden, and Britain. And they were defeated at Trafalgar. But then they turned around and defeated the Prussians just a year later. Then he decides to invade Spain because he wants to capture Portugal. He installed his brother on the Spanish throne, which was a mistake. He also tried to install one of his relatives on the throne in Mexico. The guerrilla warfare weakens the French armies, and the Spanish were good at that. For some strange reason, he decides he wants to take Russia. And the Russian Tsar Alexander leaves the coalition. And so Napoleon forms a multinational army for an invasion, 600,000 troops. There was a battle of Borodino in September of 1812. The problem was it's a good idea and a bad idea when you start using a scorched earth policy. Because if you have to retreat, you've got nothing to retreat to. I mean, you burn or destroy anything you can't carry. The French are going further and further into Russia, and Russia's just playing a waiting game, backing up and backing up and backing up. Napoleon wants a major battle, which he probably would have won, but it never happened because the Russians kept backing up. And all of a sudden, winter hits. And unless you are a Russian, you cannot survive a Russian winter. So Napoleon ordered his troops to retreat in October, and more than half of the army, over 300,000 men, died. Most of them not from battle, but from freezing to death and starving to death. Thousands of others just simply deserted. So after this Russian disaster, a new coalition unites with Russia. So there's renewed attacks now by Prussia, Russia, Austria, Sweden, and Britain, and it's called the Battle of Nations in October of 1813. Tsar Alexander I of Prussia and Frederick William III, they enter Paris in March. Napoleon surrenders and abdicates, and he was exiled to the island of Elba. They restore Louis XVI's brother, Louis XVIII, so the Bourbons are back on the throne. And all of a sudden, Napoleon escapes from Elba. He was free for about 100 days, and the Parisians were so happy to see him. And he formed a new army, and he went against the English in the Battle of Waterloo. 100 days after he escaped, he was defeated, and this time he was exiled to the island of St. Helena, where he died. Meanwhile, there's something called the Haitian Revolution going on. Because of the Caribbean sugar trade and slavery, this little island, it's worth it. Delegation from Santo Domingo, which is what it was called then, asked to be seated at the assembly in Paris, where the assembly refused. They started a rebellion. I mean, what they're saying is you've given all these freedoms to the French people and you've gotten rid of slavery, so why are we sitting out here having to be slaves and don't have any freedoms? The Mulatto Rebellion in Santo Domingo happened in August of 1791. Then there was a slave rebellion, and the British and the Spanish invaded and tried to put it down, but it wasn't going to work. Well, this rebellion is, of course, a success, and France makes free men of color citizens. And then it promised freedom to the slaves who would join the French a year later. Toussaint Louverture, victorious over the French planters, the British, and the Spanish, and he sets up a constitution. And the Haitian Constitution swore allegiance to France. They abolished slavery. They reorganized the military and established Christianity as a state religion. Well, Napoleon sees Haiti as a center of expanded French colonial empire. What he wants to do is to go in there and put down that rebellion, take control of the island, and move up to the Gulf of Mexico and retake the Louisiana Purchase from the United States. That was his grand plan. The war became a nightmare, and the army collapsed in December, and Haiti declares its independence a year later. It kind of set an example to non-Europeans and enslaved peoples, and it scared the heck out of the people in the United States because it's a nation of slavery, and that's not too far off our coastline. And of course, we're hearing about it, and our slaves are hearing about this rebellion. And the last thing we want is a successful slave rebellion in the United States. They contributed to the British decision to abolish slavery, this whole business down here. Kind of set an example. And that basically concludes the lecture for Chapter 18. I have a very small, I think it's just a few minute long film on the revolution in Haiti. I think you need to watch that before you go and answer your questions on your quiz, all those big hard questions, 10 questions. It shouldn't take you long. And like I say, I know you're short of time as I am too, but good luck.